Teachers are quitting in droves, and kids in high school are barely even learning how to write a single paragraph nowadays. You've probably heard how TikTok and iPads are rewiring our children's attention spans before they even start school. I've seen a lot of these videos on social media, and I know you have as well, and you probably have seen the same exhausted look on these teachers' faces. People who are being criminally underpaid to find every single way possible to engage students to sit through a single lecture, while there's a rampant amount of cheating going on with students offloading basic math and writing to AI nowadays. I think it's been a while since we as a culture discussed why our education system still sucks. With everything that's happening around in the world, somehow the most important foundation to our society is slowly and constantly crumbling under the weight of its own terrible ability to keep up with the times. The same questions that we asked 30 years ago about how we can improve our schools are still being asked today, and the answers have not changed at all either. This video is not going to tread on the same basic talking points about why our education system still sucks, like how the Industrial Revolution has produced workers instead of thinkers, or that standardization is the enemy to all of education. This video is actually going to be going much deeper than that, and I actually did find a real modern day example of how we can make the education system we have today be much better and help kids become much more functional and well-rounded adults. So a question I wanted to ask you guys is this: what do you want to learn? This is a question I feel like no one in our education system has ever actually asked their students. We all intuitively understand how school needs to foster creativity, but it all really does all stem from this single question that we'll keep coming back to as this video comes along, and also the key to how a model example of an education system that actually works can be applied today into your community and mine. To understand what prevents us from having a functional education system, there are three questions we must explore. Why was school built this way? Why does it still work this way? And why hasn't anyone fixed it? I was really genuinely excited to make this video because I've always wanted to understand why things have only gotten worse, and especially because now the head of the US Department of Education is calling the most disruptive technology of our time A1, like the steak sauce.
First graders or even pre-Ks have A1 teaching, every year starting that far down in the grades, and that's a wonderful thing.
I think it's really important to go all the way back to find out what actually went wrong, and more importantly, how regular people like you and I can actually start fixing it. This is literally the best video I've ever made thus far, and I promise you that this video is worth your time, and I think you'll really come out of this really wanting to make an impact. So let's just get into it. A lot of videos online cite Horace Mann as the origin of everything wrong with the American education system, but as I dug a little bit more into why exactly that was, I found that the story was incomplete, and that's because we actually had the opportunity to throw out Mann's playbook and adopt something far better for our kids. Instead, though, we went with it anyways, and this whole agreement, and rather disagreement actually, started with between two men in the earliest 20th century. The first man was John Dewey, and John Dewey believed that curiosity wasn't something that you taught children, but that it was already something inside of them. So what he did was that he opened a lab school in the University of Chicago in 1896 where children learned by doing, by questioning, and by chasing what genuinely interested them. The question, his entire philosophy was built around something simple: what do you want to learn? On the other side of the table was Elwood Cubberley, Dean of Stanford School of Education, and he had a very different take on this idea. In his own words actually, school are in a sense factories in which the raw products, children, are to be shaped and fashioned into products to meet the various demands of life. Cubberley's education system was the system that helped create the phrase that I feel like you and I find very resonant today: what do I need to pass? And that was because while America was industrializing fast, people with money and political power needed something that they could audit, scale, and manage from the top down, and Cubberley gave them exactly that. Cubberley's dislike of Dewey ran so deep actually that when he donated funds for the Stanford School of Education's building, he removed Dewey's name from the facade entirely, despite Dewey being recognized as America's foremost educational thinker at that time. The debate vanished so completely from the historical record that most people learn of the history of our American education system as a story of assembly lines, not as a story of a better world that was once considered, understood, but deliberately left behind. And the result of that lost history is the schools that our children now sit in today. For example, a kid who is obsessed with recreating sound effects from movies doesn't know that he can become a Foley artist, which is something I didn't even know of before this video. And instead, they'll probably just go study psychology because that's what everyone does after they cheer up their friend after one single conversation. The problem with the system is that it doesn't just fail to channel these kids' passions and interests into something, it's that it also sands them down into whatever generic category fits these available boxes. And then people wonder why they show up to work feeling empty and unmotivated frustrated all the time. If at any point we just asked these kids what they wanted to learn, instead of them going through the whole system and eventually asking themselves what they needed to pass, we would have far less people with regrets of what a life that could have been, instead of people who are actually content with the job that they are actually pursuing. I was astounded to know that when we had the research studies that shows that we had this education system this whole time, one that created smarter people and understood real systemic issues and how to solve them, it made me feel angry and hopeless that we had this in the palm of our hands, and then we tossed it to the side because there was a much cheaper and more efficient way of running things. But fortunately, the fight for a better education system didn't just stop 200 years ago, because there is one woman who was teaching in one of the worst performing school districts in all of New York who took on the challenge that Dewey himself never got to finish. East Harlem, District 4. Only 16% of kids were reading at grade level. The dropout rate was approaching 93% by graduation, and at the local high school, nearly half of all enrolled students weren't showing up at all by second period. Teachers cycled through buildings that felt less like places of learning and more like places everyone was just waiting to escape. Then comes Deborah Meyer, and she had spent years reading Dewey and believed he was right. When District 4 Superintendent Anthony Alvarado was desperate to try anything to fix District 4, he gave Debbie permission to open a school. She didn't ask for much. She received actually a few floors of a rundown 75-year-old building on the East 103rd Street. She started with 32 kids and a handful of teachers who shared her beliefs, with no outside funding or even any guarantee that this experiment would work. She started with one rule: children would come to Central Park East because their parents chose it. She never made any promises about the outcomes of her school, and she didn't use a single standardized curriculum from anyone above her. All she had to do going into this experiment was to ask a single question to her students very intentionally: what do you want to learn? What she built inside those walls was a direct inversion of what everything Coverly had designed. The school was small enough that teachers knew every student not just by their name, but by their personal stories, what they struggle with, what lit them up, what questions they couldn't stop asking. Teachers didn't receive curriculums from a central office, but instead, they built it together and shaped it around the actual lives of the kids in front of them. A third grade class studying medieval society learned about the material by building castles and armor, and went on the field trips to the cloisters in Upper Manhattan to see what medieval buildings actually looked like in person. Instead of reading textbooks, they learned about the origins of New York City and traced the history of the Dutch settlement and made maps of everything. To both the students and the teachers, the curriculum was a plan that made everyone excited to see what they could learn next. They got to learn about the world through things children could actually touch and see. Within 3 months of opening, enrollment had grown 50% as word spread through the neighborhood. Parents who had never trusted a school before were walking their kids through these doors. Kids who had arrived as non-readers were reading in just 6 months because they were provided books they wanted to read instead of being forced to do phonics drills. One teacher who joined the staff in 1977 described it this way: she came to know children through their work, and they came to know themselves through producing it. The results were impossible to ignore as well. Of the students who graduated from Central Park East between 1977 and 1984, only 2 of them are known to have dropped out of secondary school, in a city where more than 40% of students dropped out overall. Of the first 2 graduating classes of secondary schools in 1991 and 1992, over 90% went on to go to college, and since 1979, at least 90% of 6th graders scored at or above grade level, despite most entering in 2nd grade reading well below it. The chancellor of New York City schools eventually showed up and asked her how to replicate this. Researchers came to study Deborah Meyer's system, and in 1992 they worked with education reformer Ted Sizer, and Meyer raised $3 million to launch 6 new schools modeled on Central Park East, and it genuinely looked like for a moment the model could spread. Inside a city and inside a whole school system that was still running on Coverly's blueprint, Meyer had somehow done it. She had proven to herself that Dewey was right and that the evidence was sitting right there in East Harlem, visible to anyone who wanted to look. As you can come to expect though, if Deborah Meyer already figured this out and the proof was undeniable, then why are we still sitting in the school system that Coverly had designed? You can probably think that the easy answer to why the system still works like this is probably bureaucracy. After all, school boards move very slowly, administrators protect their turf, there's a lot of egos at play, to say the least. The system itself incentivizes itself to keep working exactly the way it already is. And while all of that is true, if slow bureaucracy was the only thing holding back Meyer's model from spreading, then you would eventually expect for the system to catch up. 50 years is a long time, and for nothing to have changed, there's something clearly much more structural that held Meyer from her system being developed. You just heard how the Chancellor of New York City Schools showed up at Central Park East and asked Meyer to launch 6 new schools modeled on what she had built. That moment was more so actually the beginning of the end though. The problem was that Debbie's ambitions grew and she wanted to expand her reach, so she left for Boston in 1996 to start a new school in Roxbury, and taking with her the very thing that also made Central Park East what it was. And I think it's also worth mentioning that Meyer was also leaving at a time where things weren't exactly going smoothly either. I mean, throughout her time at Central Park East, she had been fighting on multiple different fronts. The Central Board refused to grant waivers that would allow her teachers to work the hours the model actually required. The teachers union grew suspicious of the flexibility her staff operated with, seeing it as a threat to their contractual protections. And the principal of the building that housed Central Park East waged an ongoing turf war over who controlled what spaces. A reasonable person watching all of this from the outside would assume that when her model eventually faltered, that those were the forces that killed it, but that's not really what happened. Central Park East Secondary School didn't ever get shut down, and it never lost funding, and nobody even ever declared it as a failure. What actually really happened instead was that the school was slowly being filled with new teachers who had never lived inside the culture she built, who hadn't spent the years deliberately in the painstaking process of building the shared values with the teachers and students around them. As schools grew, the decision that had once been made collectively by a small group of deeply aligned people now had to be made with a larger staff and no shared history. The question that had driven everything, which was, what do you want to learn, stopped being the culture and started being aligned in an orientation document that many new hires read once and then filed it away. This is the part of the conversation that no one really talks about when they talk about education reform and why it still hasn't been fixed yet. Meyer didn't lose to a single villain with a face attached to it. The union did not crush her, and no school board conspiracy dismantled what she had built. What happened was far more mundane and far more damning, which was that the system just kept doing what systems do, in hiring, rotating, standardizing, scaling, and in doing so, it quietly replaced everything that made the model irreplaceable and made everything much more manageable at the end of the day. The thing about Meyer's model was that it took a lot for it to work because it was built on a trust between specific people in a specific place. Meyer's teachers stayed late nights after school when their contracts said they couldn't because they truly believed in what they were building together. Meyer's students learned real lessons because the adults around them were genuinely curious people who made curiosity the natural state of being in that building. As I read this, it was just so heartbreaking because it's true. I mean, this kind of culture cannot just be written into a policy document. It can't survive a hiring cycle that brings in people who never experienced it, and it really can't scale with a system that treats teachers as interchangeable parts because the whole model depends on teachers who treat the job as anything but interchangeable. This is the real fundamental reason why school itself has never really changed, because it's not just bureaucracy moving slowly. It's the system that Meyer has built, incredible as it was always going to fail no matter how much you try to scale it. You can't standardize trust, and you also can't standardize genuine curiosity either. You cannot audit whether a teacher actually knows a child's story or they're just performing the appearance of knowing it. And so when the system tried to scale what Meyer had built, it scaled the parts that it could measure quietly and discarded the parts that couldn't. And what remained was Central Park East on the outside had nothing to do with what it originally looked like from the inside. What I kept asking myself as I did my research was no longer why the system doesn't like good ideas, but rather if it's possible to build a real system that still has the original values without the original people still being there that made it. So later in this video, I will still have an example of how we can actually make this happen, but there is a much more pressing question that we still need to answer because, truth be told, why hasn't anyone fixed this system yet? As I was making this video, I did notice a pattern to the answers of the questions that I initially posed. Why is our education system like this? Because it was designed for the way it was in its times. Why is it still like this? Well, it's because the political inertia of scaling even a working system means it eventually stops working. And why hasn't anyone fixed it? Well, because our culture has kept it exactly where it is. Let me explain. Meyer's original students, the ones who went through Central Park East before the model got hollowed out, went on to college at rates that did embarrass the wealthier districts. A lot of them came out successful. They went back to teach or they went into careers, and all of them shared the same sense of genuine curiosity for the world. The problem was that the world that they graduated into was a one that didn't reward their learning, but one of their credentials. No matter what Meyer students were ever going to be capable of, their experience in East Harlem ran headfirst into a system that said that you still needed a degree to do anything. It was your parents, your employers, and it was everything about our culture that was signaling that showed that nothing of what you actually learned mattered if you didn't have anything to physically show for it. There's this principle called Goodhart's Law that rings very true into the system that these students graduated in and also into our wider culture, which is the basic idea that once you have a system that measures competency and measures it through a credential, the pursuit of the credential is what becomes more important, and therefore your ability to be competent has no bearing as to whether or not you actually can receive the credential, aka like a degree. I have a finance degree, and as a person with a finance degree, you might expect me to know how to do some finance stuff, and honestly, that could not be further from the truth. There's things I definitely picked up on, don't get me wrong, but by and large, the fact that I feel like I didn't learn anything is definitely an indictment of how broken college actually is. It's just kind of crazy, by the way, that we have to go to college for 4 years to get a bachelor's degree, but 2 of those years is just getting general education credits for stuff that we should have already learned in high school. By the time you get to the 3rd and 4th year of college, at least for me, you end up going into a class where you just have to punch in a calculator on how to calculate the value of a bond or how to amortize a mortgage, all stuff you don't need a degree for. You can go on a website and look up how to do those things right now. The point being is that I still didn't get any real value out of college. If you're much older than I am, then you can consider this behavior lazy, because you can see all these kids cheating in college and you have to try harder. I understand it first and foremost, but ultimately this is also just what the system incentivizes, because we don't care what happens for as long as we get the degree. The question remains ever so true: what do I need to pass? The current generation of kids growing up with AI right now are using it every chance they get as well. I mean, you can watch any video about how Gen Alpha has terrible literacy rates, but I think the most absurd thing that you'll find is that people in high school literally still need to be taught how to write a single 5-sentence paragraph. It's really alarming. Our next generation is using AI at any moment on anything remotely difficult. And somehow, this is a hot take, but this is not their fault. I mean, a kid who never asked what they wanted to learn will always use the most powerful thinking tool at their disposal to just write the 5-paragraph essay about the civil rights movement and move on. But what we should be mad at is that our system is not creating the kinds of kids that should be so curious and passionate about how our society came to be, that they'll use AI to find out about why the civil rights movement was the way it was, how it was important, and use that technology and find out how we can tackle other forms of systemic oppression. I know this is an example that gets brought up to death, but it is fundamentally true. We didn't throw away the calculator, we used it to start answering more complex math questions, and we should be using AI in the same exact way, but instead we're using AI as teachers to catch students on when they start using AI. I mean, it's just ridiculous that we go through this incestuous cycle, and the system itself just produces the worst kinds of workers. Here's an example. According to Gallup's 2024 State of the Global Workplace report, 62% of employees globally are not engaged at work, doing the minimum required, detached from their jobs, filling a seat, and watching the clock. And while I've worked with people who genuinely weren't pulling their weight, you can't look at 62% of the global workforce and conclude that they're all individually failing. So here's what the system has actually produced. It has produced workers who learn to do the minimum to clear the bar, and employers who can't trust anything other than the bar to tell them who's worth hiring. Both sides are stuck in the same broken system, and workers are doing the minimum because that's what they were trained to do. There's still employers who are filtering people out by degrees that stopped meaning anything a long time ago, and nobody ends up winning in this zero-sum game, and nobody even bothers wondering why they should still even continue playing it. A Harvard Business School report found that 61% of employers admitted to rejecting applicants with the requisite skills and experience simply because they lacked a college degree. Like, I mean, are you serious? More than half of employers already know the person in front of them can do the job and still say no because the piece of paper isn't there. The credential stopped being a measure of ability a long time ago, and it just became a comfort blanket for these employers who just don't want to trust their own judgment in hiring people who are qualified. Our culture defends every inch of this degree system. Our system was designed because it creates an easy way to measure good workers. The politics of our system says that it must work this way because it's easy to measure. And the culture of our system reinforces this idea because that's what we've come to expect out of our system. That's how the process has always worked, and that's how it has to work apparently. And so of course nothing changes, and the teachers burn out, the kids check out, the degrees start piling up in the back of a corner, and somewhere in the back of everyone's mind, there's a faint memory of a question that nobody in this whole chain has never even thought to ask. What do you want to learn? If by this point you are very frustrated like I am about why the system is still stuck in as rigid as it is, then good, because that's the feeling I want you to have, and the feeling that we've all probably been having already. The good news I want to provide you in this section is that there is an exit, and it requires us to learn the mistakes of what came before for us to implement a better solution. Deborah Meyer proved that the design could work, but what she could not prove was whether the design could survive without her. The culture she had built inside Central Park East was a very personal one that required specific teachers, specific relationships, specific conversations between specific people. When those people left, the culture left with them. So how do we learn from the lessons of a system that needs to still stay without the people staying with it? Well, Dennis Litkey and Elliot Washor had watched enough of education reform to understand that lesson. Both had spent 30 years as teachers and principals, and both had seen good ideas get absorbed and hollowed out the same way Myers did. So when Rhode Island began re-examining its entire education system in the mid-1990s, it gave them an opening. They built community support, brought stakeholders from the government, unions, universities, and industries to the table, and they actually got state-level approval before they even opened a single door to a school. The Met, when it was created, wasn't just considered a charter school or a niche experiment. This was an actual funded school, legitimately established by the state itself, which meant that the normal bureaucratic response of hiring cycles and rotating administrators and standardization couldn't even touch it the same way that it touched Meyer. They opened the school in 1996 with 50 students at first, mostly kids who hadn't fit anywhere else in a building that happened to be the office of the Rhode Island Department of Education. The question driving everything from day one was not, what do you need to pass? Every kid actually got an advisor who knew them personally. Every kid had a learning plan built around what they actually cared about, and every kid spent 2 days in a week in real-world internships in fields that matched their interests. And assessments happened through exhibitions where students presented what they had built and learned to a room of teachers, mentors, and parents. The question driven everything from the first day was when a student had walked in, they were asked, "What do you want to learn?" There's a really awesome example of a junior student at the Met who actually spent her high school years interning with a photography mentor. She actually studied alongside a professional while still being in high school, so that by the time she graduated, she earned a professional photography certification and had already launched her own wedding photography business. In 2001, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation called the Met their favorite high school in America and provided a major grant to replicate their model nationwide. And I'm also aware about Bill's implication in the Epstein files, but this is an important turning point for Big Picture Learning. Today, the organization Big Picture Learning operates in over 143 schools across 27 states and in countries including Australia, the Netherlands, Italy, India, and Canada. It's incredible to see that we're not looking at some exceptional group of students either. There are longitudinal studies that show that BPL graduates enroll in college at equal rates regardless of race, gender, or their parents' level of education. English language learners are more likely to enroll in post-secondary education than native speakers actually, which is the exact opposite of what every other system produces. And 74% of working alumni got their job through a contact they made during their high school internship. You can literally see how these kids are not being trained to be better test takers like how you and I probably were. These kids actually know how to build relationships, follow curiosity, and move through a world that doesn't come with the syllabus. Big Picture Learning Australia started the same way the Met did, small, deliberate, and one student at a time. But by 2017, they were facing the same wall every alternative school eventually hits, which was that their students were extraordinary and their outcomes were undeniable. But when graduation actually came, these students had to still present a standardized test score to get into university. So they tried something that had never been tried before. In 2017, 3 students actually walked into university admission offices with no standardized test score, and they instead brought portfolios of real work, internships, projects, exhibitions, and documented evidence of their genuine learnings, and they asked the admission committees to actually acknowledge what they had done, and sure enough, they actually said yes. By 2019, based on what those 3 students proved was possible, Big Picture Learning Australia partnered with the Assessment Research Centre at the University of Melbourne to build a formal framework around what they were doing. Thankfully, their goal wasn't to standardize the process, but to formally make it more legible to institutions that needed something that they could trust. The result was International Big Picture Learning Credential, a portfolio and interview-based qualification that documents real learning, real curiosity, real work done in the real world, and it says not by how smart a student is through their grades, but by how a student is actually smart through their work. The credential launched formally in 2020, and since then, 270 graduates have received university offers using it. In 2022, 100% of students who applied to university received at least one offer. Like seriously, how often do you see 100% in any statistic nowadays? 20 universities now accept this credential, including the Australian National University, with the University of Technology Sydney and the University of New South Wales currently in negotiations to join them. I mean, look at all of this. I mean, it shows that the culture can change and that the culture can demand for a better design system. The institutions built to receive the next generation looked at what big picture learning did, and they said, we trust this. We recognize the students' work as evidence of someone worth admitting. And all of this was accomplished without BPL ever having to compromise on its philosophy, and instead letting the outcomes of their students speak for themselves. I'll link the sources down in the description below of the documents I read because it's actually so interesting. I mean, if you're the person that gets kind of excited about, how this all works and this stuff, you'll see how this article dives deep into how they actually create a system that fosters well-rounded adults. John Dewey started this whole expenditure to foster a better education system with the sole question of, what do you want to learn? And Deborah Meyer proved the question was right in 1974, and Big Picture Learning proved that the question could survive and scale in 1996. And Australia proved in 2020 that when you build a system that produces people who know what they want to learn, the institution built to receive them will eventually learn to trust that question as well. And the funny thing is that it all started with 3 students and a portfolio. So of course the question was always right, and we just spent the past 100 years building the wrong system around it. So now it's finally time to find out how we can actually start building the correct systems around that question. I want to talk to you directly as the audience for a second. The fact that you just watched a 30+ minute video about why the education system is broken tells me something about you. You didn't need a teacher to assign this video to you. You followed the question because it bothered you enough to chase it. And although the algorithm likely served you this video, you chose to watch it still. And the system that has spent hundreds of years trying to convince you that you had no curiosity left within you, it looks like it failed because you are still here. The curiosity that you have, I want you to go and chase it. Spend whatever time you can in this busy, chaotic world to chase a question that you've had for years. I don't want to spin this into advice where you can eventually make some money out of a side hustle. I want you to exercise this muscle that you have of curiosity and pursue what makes you more fulfilled, more happy, more wiser. This system has taught us to suppress this curiosity that we all have. So if you're a parent, I want you to go ask your kids the question of not what they did at school, but what they want to learn. Because if you ask this question consistently, it shapes everything about who these kids eventually become. That's how this curiosity loop starts running in the right direction inside your own life. And life is seriously so much more interesting when you're finally answering the questions you've always had. It's why I started this channel, and why I feel like after so much existentially dreadful content out there, that I feel like I need to start tackling why our systems are designed the way they are and how we can hope to recreate it. If you believe in the message of not just vague platitudes of hope, but real actionable hope you can act on, the kind of hope that gets you excited to do something out there in the world and making a real difference, supporting my channel by subscribing and sharing this video to people who really need to hear it is all I ask, because I do see the value of what I'm talking about here. And so with that being said, I don't want to end this video on just some self-help advice about how you should go make a difference out there. I actually want to give you some real feedback and some real help about what you can do to implement your own big picture learning inside your own community. So I want you to start here on the Big Picture Learning official contact form on their website, specifically for communities that want to bring this model to their own school district. They offer something called a school success study, which is a 1 to 2 day visit where their team comes to your community, talks to students, parents, and teachers, and analyzes your district specific data and produces a customized report showing exactly how the model could spread in your context. Big Picture Learning doesn't believe in scaling for its own sake. They work with communities based on local needs and local readiness, the same way that they built the Met around the specific kids sitting in front of them in Providence in 1996. If you're already involved with your local school community in any way, I am asking that you directly look into this. Go in with no other expectation than to ask one single question. What can I do to start bettering my school's community? I guarantee that this question will take you much further than any bulleted to-do list of what to do than I could give you today. The story about how any one of us can lead the charge into education reform and shape the next generation as we know it will always feel very small. After all, it did start with 3 students and a portfolio in Australia, or 32 kids in a rundown building in East Harlem, or 50 students in downtown Rhode Island with nowhere else to go. Every version of this story has always started small, with a John Dewey, a Debbie Meyer, a Dennis Litkey, or an Elliot Washore. One person who was desperate enough to ask a different question and to ask the questions to these institutions willing to let them try. You are capable of being any one of these people, because a generation of kids who grow up being asked what they want to learn will ask harder questions than we were ever taught to. They'll look at problems we accepted as permanent and wonder why nobody else tried harder. They will build things we haven't even imagined yet, and they will care about a world we taught ourselves to clock out of. The future that I'm showing you is not one of a far-off utopia that will happen long after we die. This is the future that happens when enough people start to ask the right questions. What do you want to learn? That felt good.